There's a person who's always very brave and always so bold and has inspired me for many, many years and is a great colleague. He is Professor Emeritus in University of British Columbia. He is the founder of the Ecological Footprint Analysis. He is a co-founder of One Earth, and he's a fantastic human being. And he's going to tell you how the storm is approaching. Bill.
I started to wonder who she was introducing there for a moment. There are millions, not millions, lots of things we can do. There's no question about it. And these guys have done a fantastic job. If you can get a hold of that report, it's well worth reading. But if there isn't the social context and the institutional support for people to do these things, they don't do them. There are several studies that show that the best environmentally educated people on Earth have exactly the same consumption patterns and lifestyles as people who don't give a goddamn about the environment in the same income bracket. So this is a huge cognitive problem. There's a tremendous difficulty in motivating people to do the things that have to be done. And I could spend the whole rest of the evening just telling you what the psychological barriers are that create that kind of constraint. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something much more difficult. I want to take us back to the kind of big picture from which we're operating here. We have to understand something fundamental that no government has understood in any reasonable manner, that the Earth is already in a state of overshoot. If you're going to talk about lighter living, this is where you've got to start. Overshoot means that we are consuming natural capital, the products of nature, ecosystems themselves, much faster than they can regenerate. And we're filling natural waste sinks to overflowing. Climate change is a waste management problem. Carbon dioxide is the single largest waste by weight of industrial economies, okay? So all of the symptoms of collapsing biodiversity, land degradation, climate change, and so on and so forth are simply that, symptoms of overshoot, of gross human ecological dysfunction. We have ceased to be citizens of the planet. We have turned ourselves, through our technological optimism, our growth fetish, into parasites on the planet. We are literally consuming the biosphere, converting it into human bodies, animal bodies, and all of the artifacts of our culture, and in the process, inevitably diminishing nature. It is an absolute contradiction to say that you can have even green growth and conserve the so-called environment, because all growth involves the consumption of material and the dissipation of energy, which means a further encroachment on the domain of nature that remains. Do you know that in pre-industrial times, well, pre-agricultural times, human beings constituted far less than 1% of the mammalian biomass of Earth? 10,000 years later, the human mass is 34% of the mammalian biomass on planet Earth. Our domestic animals are an additional 60%. So together, we comprise over 95% actually of the biomass of mammalian critters on the planet, leaving nature that remaining 4.5%. Those great herds of Africa are just living on the fringes of existence because we've literally, through our growth, displaced them from their ecosystems and their habitats. So we are now sustaining the growth ethic by by permanently dissipating the very biophysical basis of our own existence. This is what it looks like. It's an unsustainable fossil fuel-driven exponential growth. For 10,000 years, nothing happened. We didn't grow. For the last 200 years, we've been engaged in a process of exponential or super exponential growth. It produces this inordinate hockey stick graph. But we have to understand that only 7 generations of 20,000 generations of human beings have experienced sufficient growth even to notice it in their lifetimes. It's just our last few generations. Yet we take this to be the norm. What we think of in our culture as the norm is the single most anomalous or abnormal period in the history of the human species. The global picture is this, and all of the numbers that we've heard about so far, the big reductions of 70, 80, 90% are based on this simple fact. We're in 68% overshoot by the most conservative of our eco-footprint measurements. So we are literally consuming the planet out from under us, and it means increasingly every one of us is competing with everyone else for the ever-diminishing capacity of this planet. This week, a new report came out about the plunging loss of tuna in the seas. It's just one of many fisheries in dire straits. As more and more people rise higher on the income chain and start eating more and more meat, we're not going to eat less meat. The trend on the planet is more and more meat consumption as incomes grow, because that's what people do unless there's a social environment, a cultural environment, a political environment to turn that around. It happened extremely quickly. Get your head around these numbers, because we're in the fishbowl. We don't notice the water. Homo sapiens, the recognizable modern anatomical species that we are, is about 200,000 years old. It took 200,000 years virtually to hit 1 billion people. That's a long, flat period. But then the population expanded by 7.5-fold in 200 years. 1/2000th, or rather 1/1000th as much time as it took to reach the first billion. And in the meantime, gross world product increased by 100%, or 100-fold rather, not 100%, 100-fold in real terms. Per capita incomes increased by a factor of 13, 25-fold in rich countries, and fossil energy consumption, which powered this growth, increased in 200 years by 1,300-fold. And the Earth hasn't grown any larger. And if you doubt the relationship between the human population, the scale of the human enterprise, and energy consumption, here is a comparison of the population plus per capita consumption and total consumption. They're virtually identical curves. Take away the energy, the whole rest of the system collapses. Here's another consequence of exponential growth. The area under the curve represents the total consumption that took place in the period that we're talking about. 50% of all the fossil fuel ever used on planet Earth has been consumed in the last 30 years. Did you hear what I said? 50% of all the fossil fuel ever consumed, 50% of the human emissions of carbon dioxide in the last 30 years, 90% of all the fossil fuels ever used have been burned in my lifetime. This is how incredibly compressed this time scale has become as a result of this exponentiating kind of growth. Now, fossil fuel is the basis upon which our society is based. We are suspended on a fountain of oil. Take that away and the whole thing crashes if you don't have a viable substitute. Just look around you. It's just energy, 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 energy everywhere. Okay? And it's not just fossil fuel, it's everything else that has increased at that same exponentiating rate. And we all now rely on efficiency. Efficiency will save the day. These enormous increases in consumption of just about everything, half of all fossil fuels in 30 years, have taken place during a period of unprecedented increases in the efficiency of everything that we do. Okay? So, we are already in overshoot. Here's the question we all have to face. Do any of you really think the ecosphere could survive another doubling of human economic activity and associated impacts as is expected by 2050? Because in the doubling, look, with exponential growth, the increment gained in any single period is equal to the sum of all the gains made in all previous periods of exponential growth. So if everything were to double again in the next 30 years, we will consume in the next 30 years everything we've already consumed up to date. And to date, don't forget, is, well, I've already given you those numbers. So here's the really desperate challenge that we've already been introduced to. If we want to avoid catastrophic climate change, We have to hold global temperatures well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and pursue efforts. Listen to this mealy-mouth language. We're going to pursue efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. That means reducing carbon emissions by about 50% below 2010 levels, which are actually lower than today's levels, by 2030. That means that starting right now, every year between now and 2030, that's about 11 years, 7% reduction every year. I will bet my entire income for the next year that we won't reduce carbon emissions by 7% in the next year, or the year after that, or the year after that. We need complete decarbonization by 2050 if we're going to avoid these limits. Well, don't worry about it, because we all know that green energy is taking over. Here are two statements. I just pulled these off the internet. If you look up green energy, bingo, you'll have 150 references to salvation. Solar photovoltaic, and wind power are rapidly getting cheaper and more abundant, so much so that they are on track to entirely supplant fossil fuels worldwide within 2 decades. Boy, doesn't that just make you feel good? An area of Earth 335 kilometers by 335 kilometers, a nice little square, with solar panels out in the Sahara Desert is sufficient to provide us with 17.4 terawatts of power. All the energy needs of the world in solar energy in a little patch of the Sahara Desert. Someone ought to tell this guy that one sandstorm and it's all gone. One sandstorm and it's all gone, okay? So both of these statements are primarily out there to get people to invest in alternative energy of one kind or another, because clearly it's going to be a boom. I have a very good friend, an energy analyst from Texas, now teaching in Saudi Arabia, actually. This is Pat Seck's corollary. The more you know about the role of energy and its nature in our society, the closer you get to losing all hope. Okay. I think this is brilliant. Now, before you laugh and think, well, he's just a goof nut, look at this curve. This curve shows two things. First, the enormously rapid acceleration of solar energy output on planet Earth. That's the golden curve on the left. It also shows the annual increase in global demand for electricity. So listen to me. The annual increase in demand for electricity in every year but one in the last 20 years or so has been greater than the entire output of all the solar installation that's gone on for the last 30 years. Okay? If you throw wind in here, it takes 2 years of growth at the margin to wipe out all the gains contributed by all the wind and solar energy installed on planet Earth. So that when we look at the big picture, the little gold tribble on the bottom is the contribution by solar energy. The global electricity demand is the red line. It's rising faster than the increase in the alternative. The blue little bit at the end is just showing you 2 years of energy consumption attributable to fossil fuels, which is twice as great as even the power capacity thing. So here's really the choices before us as a culture. I hope I've made my point, that there are no easy substitutes for fossil fuels. There's 2 points. We are utterly dependent on energy to maintain anything remotely like the lifestyle that we have, or even a very considerable, materially less advantageous lifestyle. And there are no substitutes for the fossil fuel at present. And none, frankly, on the foreseeable future. I mean, people will come up to me and say, you know what, because fission energy is almost ready to come out, or fusion energy. Listen, I've been in this game a long time. For 50 years, fusion energy was right around the corner. So don't expect that to save your butt anytime soon. And by the way, has it occurred to any of the energy advocates that if we continue to use energy from whatever source, as we use it today, we'll just consume the rest of the planet and go down anyway, okay? It's just not on. You cannot have the rates of consumption. Actually, it's a conversion process. the wild of nature into the human artifact, but we need the wildness of nature, the life support functions to keep us going. So here's our choices. I've got 2 minutes to... That was my introductory remarks. So what... We can avoid disastrous climate change. We could. We could program rapid cutbacks in fossil fuels in the absence of adequate substitutes. This would risk high unemployment and business failures, put cities in jeopardy, trigger civil unrest, and lead to social chaos and economic collapse. That's a pretty comforting option, isn't it all? Or we can risk accelerating climate change, maintain our allegiance to the growth paradigm and the illusion of rescue by technology, continue with fossil fuels as a primary energizer, risk desertification, biodiversity collapse, food shortages, mass migrations, social chaos, and economic collapse. Fine choices we're putting up for ourselves. Now, everything that Rio said is true. We could, should we choose to do so, and create the appropriate socio-political policy environment, reduce our emissions by 50% without suffering, because we waste that much. But we won't do it without those preconditions that I've mentioned. Now, here's my prediction. The world will choose the second option. The world will choose the second option. Because the economy, in the minds of the culture we have created, is always more important than everything. We have to maintain a balance between the economy and nature. But keep in mind, it's a confined space. So every time the economy grows, there's less nature. There's no balance. It's constantly going out of balance as the growth dynamic occurs. And there's evidence that my prediction isn't wrong. This is a graph showing all the climate agreements over the last 50 years or so. Okay? That red line is the annual ticky-uppedness of the carbon emissions. Okay, it fluctuates on an annual basis, but it's a steady, exponentially increasing rise in carbon emissions. You cannot detect any change in the trajectory of that curve attributable to any of the many climate accords that have been signed over the many decades. We simply haven't paid any attention to our own commitments. Therefore, this is last week's publication from the U.S. Energy Information Agency, but it coincides almost identically with minor variations with the International Energy Agency. They predict that by 2050, in this case, that's our target, remember, we're going for zero emissions by 2050. Unfortunately, by then, global demand for energy, since it's absolutely necessary to maintain the growth ethic, will increase by 44%. And most of that will be provided by fossil fuel. In fact, the increase is greater than the total amount that will be provided by all alternatives, including hydro and so on, over that same period. So, what you guys have got to understand is that the destruction of the planet is apparently the price the world community is willing to pay to maintain our economic trajectory. This is what we should do right now. First of all, every politician in this campaign should stand up and acknowledge overshoot and the end of growth. We should accept the theoretical and practical difficulties of a green energy transition. We should restructure the economy to remain within the allowable carbon budget while developing sustainable alternatives. They may be out there, we just don't have them just yet. We should, on an emergency basis, be allocating the remaining carbon budget through depletion taxes, rationing quotas to essential uses. Our food system is entirely dependent on fossil fuel. You couldn't survive in this city 3 days after a collapse of the fossil fuel sector, because that's all the food there is in town. It has to be brought in constantly from elsewhere, all over the world. We need then essential uses, food production, home heating, essential transportation to provision cities, for example. We need to relocalize economic activity. You know what? Right now, there are ships traveling from North America to Europe full of biscuits. There are ships traveling from Europe to North America full of biscuits. As Herman Daly, one of my great mentors, said, why not trade recipes? Shipping, by the way, is an enormous source of fossil fuels. Develop sustainable lifestyles. Even North Americans lived happily, more happily than now, in the 60s and 70s on less than half the energy per capita that we consume today. We need to implement a global population strategy to plan a descent to the 2 or 3 billion people who could live comfortably and sustainably, indefinitely within the biophysical means of nature. So there, you got a job ahead of you, buck up, it's a great life.